There was a small plastic jug that held candy powder instead of gum. And somewhere between the first pinch on the tongue and the fourth chew, it turned into the biggest, stretchiest bubble a kid's mouth had ever made. Grape, orange crush, tropical fruit so sweet it stung the back of the throat for a second before it settled into something worth savoring. By the early 1990s, that jug sat by the register in almost every drugstore and corner store in America, rattling in backpacks and lunch bags, passed hand to hand at recess so a friend could shake out one capful, tilt their head back, and pour. It wasn't bought so much as collected. The colors, the flavors, the ritual of it. Then, one flavor at a time, it started thinning out. No announcement, no goodbye. Just an empty spot where grape used to be. How does a candy that an entire generation carried in their pockets fade away almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened? That question is where this story begins. In Yorkville, Illinois, a low industrial town about 50 miles southwest of Chicago, the Wrigley Company kept a subsidiary that most shoppers never thought to look for on a label. It was called Amaral Confections, and its entire reason for existing was to do what the parent company would never risk doing under its own name. Take chewing gum and turn it into something strange, something a kid couldn't quite explain to a parent. Something built for a shelf where Bubblicious and Bubble Yum were already fighting for the same allowance money. By the time the 1990s arrived, Amaral had already proven it could think this way. It had shredded gum into a pouch and called it Big League Chew. It had stretched gum into a 6-foot ribbon and called it bubble tape. The company's whole identity was built on a simple bet, that the format of a candy mattered as much as its flavor. The problem Amaral was trying to solve with what would become Bubble Jug wasn't a flavor problem at all. Every fruit flavor a kid could want already existed in 100 gum wrappers. The problem was boredom. The fact that a stick of gum was a stick of gum, no matter how it tasted. And a kid in 1990 had already seen every trick a manufacturer could pull with a wrapper. So somewhere inside that Yorkville plant, in a room built for testing textures rather than tastes, someone asked a different question. What if the candy wasn't gum yet when you bought it? What if it started as something closer to powdered candy, pixie dust, rock candy, the kind of thing that dissolved on contact, and only became gum the moment a kid's own mouth and their own chewing turned it into one? That idea is what separated Bubble Jug from every novelty gum that came before it. Amaral packed sweetened, flavored crystals into a squat plastic jug small enough to fit in a fist and built the entire experience around transformation. A kid unscrewed the cap, tipped the jug, poured out however much they wanted, too little, too much, it didn't matter, that was the point, and let the powder dissolve into a rush of tropical fruit or grape or orange crush before it slowly gathered itself, through chewing, into an actual piece of bubblegum. Nothing else at Amaral worked quite that way. Bubble tape stretched, Big League Chew shredded. Bubble Jug transformed, and a container that started as packaging became a toy in its own right. Something to shake, to ration, to pass to a friend for one capful and no more. The belief behind it was almost embarrassingly simple, the kind of thing that sounds obvious only after someone has already proven it works. Kids didn't just want a new taste. They wanted a reason to perform the ritual of eating candy in front of their friends. A jug you could shake and share did that in a way a 5-stick pack never could. It gave a kid a small piece of ceremony to hand off at a lunch table. And by the early 1990s, that little plastic jug was leaving the Yorkville plant by the truckload, headed for exactly the kind of shelf where ceremony sold best. The one right next to the checkout register, where a kid's hand was already reaching before a parent could say no. The early 1990s were the years Bubble Jug belonged to. It sat at checkout counters in drugstores, in the impulse buy racks of grocery stores, in the rotating wire displays gas stations kept by the door. Never quite in the same aisle as regular gum, always somewhere closer to the register, where a kid's hand could reach it before a parent had time to say no. That placement wasn't an accident. It was the same instinct that put candy bars at eye level for a 7-year-old. The shorter the distance between wanting something and paying for it, the more of it got sold. A jug of Bubble Jug rang up for pocket change money, the kind a kid could scrape together from returned bottles or a birthday $5 bill split 3 ways at the store. It wasn't a splurge. It was the thing you grabbed because you already had the money in your hand and it was right there. What made it different from grabbing a pack of gum was what happened after the purchase. A kid didn't just unwrap Bubble Jug, they performed it. The jug got shaken first, rattling the crystals loose, and then came the pour, tipped back like a tiny bottle, powder hitting the tongue in a rush of tropical fruit or grape that stung sweet for a few seconds before it started to change. That sting then settle sensation was the entire selling point, and it made the candy inherently social. A jug wasn't finished in one sitting the way a candy bar was. It invited sharing. One cap full, then wait, then pass it to the friend standing next to you, because the amount you poured was always a little bit of a gamble, and gambling is more fun with an audience. That's what made it a lunchroom currency as much as a candy. Halloween pillowcases in the early 90s were less predictable. Bubble Jug wasn't a candy aisle staple that showed up in every trick-or-treat bag, but it turned up often enough in family-size Halloween assortments and drugstore seasonal bins that finding one in a haul felt like a small, welcome surprise rather than the usual fun-size candy bar. Inside school walls, it worked differently. A kid who'd stocked up over the weekend could bring a jug to the cafeteria and dole it out capful by capful, the same way other kids traded stickers or baseball cards. It became a kind of currency precisely because it couldn't be split evenly. Someone always got a slightly bigger pour, and that unfairness was part of the fun. One woman who grew up in a small town outside Cincinnati remembers the ritual specifically. She and her best friend would split a single jug of tropical fruit on the walk home from the bus stop, passing it back and forth without ever agreeing on rules for how much was a fair pour. And by the time they reached her friend's driveway, the jug would be empty, and they'd both have gum going stale in their cheeks from over-chewing it too fast. Another recalls that her older brother used to shake his jug like a maraca before school just to torment her, refusing to open it until she begged, because the sound alone was enough to make her want it. A man who worked one summer stocking shelves at a drugstore outside Dayton remembers restocking the same wire rack by the register nearly every week because Bubble Jug turned over faster than almost anything else at that price point. Kids bought it on impulse, and impulse buys don't wait for a restock schedule. For the people who packed it, the appeal from the factory floor looked different, but no less real. A production line built to run through Wrigley's more traditional brands, sticks, tape, shredded pouches, had to be retooled to handle powder and crystal instead of pressed gum, and workers at the Yorkville plant found themselves fielding an entirely different kind of quality complaint. Not the flavor's off, but the pour is too fine, or the jug cap doesn't reseal right. It was, by the standards of a company built on juicy fruit and doublemint, a strange little product to be manufacturing at scale, and for a few years a genuinely profitable one. What was it about a candy you had to shake, pour, and gamble on that made it feel more like yours than something you simply unwrapped? Maybe it was the ritual itself, the fact that Bubble Jug asked something of the kid holding it, instead of just handing over a flavor. Maybe it was the sound of the shake or the risk of pouring too little and having to ask a friend for more. Whatever it was, it worked well enough, long enough, that an entire cohort of American kids can still describe the exact tilt of the wrist it took to pour the perfect amount. But rituals built around impulse buys and pocket change are also, by their nature, fragile. A candy that depends on being shaken and shared and bought on a whim doesn't have the built-in loyalty of a candy bar with a name every parent already trusts. And by the middle of the decade, the very things that made Bubble Jug feel special, the mess, the unpredictability, the fact that it wasn't quite gum and wasn't quite candy, were starting to look, from a boardroom's perspective, less like charm and more like a liability. Once a novelty item at Amaral proved itself in a handful of test markets, the path to national shelves ran through Wrigley's existing sales machinery, the same relationships and same regional distributors that had spent decades getting juicy fruit and doublemint into every corner, store, and supermarket checkout in the country. Bubble Jug didn't need Wrigley to build new relationships with grocery chains. It needed those relationships to make room for something the buyers had never stocked before. A candy that was neither a pressed stick of gum nor a bagged confection, sold in a resealable plastic jug instead of a wrapper, didn't fit neatly into a grocery buyer's existing category codes. Getting it onto a shelf meant convincing regional buyers at drugstore chains and supermarket checkout lane vendors that it belonged somewhere between the impulse candy rack and the gum pegboard, and that it would turn over fast enough to earn its spot. It did, and it did quickly. What had started as a test market item in a handful of regions spread within a couple of years to checkout lanes and drugstore counters, coast to coast, riding the same distribution network that already delivered Big League Chew and Bubble Tape to tens of thousands of stores. The expansion wasn't measured in a splashy ad campaign or a single national launch date. It moved the way most checkout lane candy moved, chain by chain, region by region, as buyers who'd seen it sell well in a neighboring district agreed to give it rack space of their own. By the early to mid-1990s, a kid could find the same purple and yellow jug in a Midwestern drugstore, a Southern gas station, and a West Coast supermarket checkout lane, all stocked through the same Amaral sales network that ran beneath the more visible Wrigley brand name. Flavor was where the regional variation showed up most. Tropical fruit, grape, and orange crush weren't distributed with perfectly even weight across the country. Some regions leaned harder into tropical and citrus flavors. Others saw more grape move off the shelf, and buyers adjusted their orders accordingly. It was a small, quiet acknowledgement that a national candy still had to answer to a kid's actual local taste, even inside a single unified brand. The other place Bubble Jug found a real traction was outside the supermarket entirely. Amaral's novelty gum line already had a foothold in movie theater concession stands and airport newsstands, spaces where a small, self-contained, mess contained by its own jug candy made more sense than a bag of loose gum pieces. A jug fit neatly into a coat pocket during a 2-hour movie, and it didn't need refrigeration or careful handling the way chocolate did, which made it an easy add to a concession counter already stocked with Big League Chew and Bubble Tape. Seasonally, it showed up in drugstore Halloween displays and end cap assortments, alongside more traditional candy aisle staples. Not a guaranteed presence in every trick-or-treat bag, the way a fun-size candy bar was, but common enough in family-sized seasonal bins that finding one felt like part of the October candy landscape rather than an anomaly. What none of that rapid, register line-driven growth solved, though, was the tension built into the product itself. A national rollout meant national volume, and national volume meant a plant in Yorkville, Illinois, running powder and crystal candy through equipment that had been designed and tuned for pressed gum sticks and shredded pouches, keeping the shake-pour gamble ritual consistent at a much larger production scale. Making sure a jug poured the same in a store in Ohio as it did in a store in Oregon was a harder manufacturing problem than it looked from a kid's hands. Every dollar Amaral spent solving that consistency problem was a dollar spent making sure a novelty candy didn't feel less special once it was everywhere. And that was the quiet cost of success that Bubble Jug carried from its very first national orders. A candy sold partly on the thrill of unpredictability. How much would pour out? How it would taste the instant it hit the tongue needed to become perfectly predictable at scale in order to survive on a national shelf. Could a candy built around a kid's sense of ritual and gamble stay special once it had been standardized enough to sell in 50 states? For a few years, the answer looked like yes. The jug kept selling, kept turning over fast at the register, kept getting restocked on schedule in stores from coast to coast. But the machinery that made that possible was also, quietly, the same machinery that would make it easy, later when taste shifted, to trim a flavor here, tighten a production line there, and treat Bubble Jug less like a beloved ritual and more like one SKU among hundreds in a much larger candy portfolio. By the middle of the 1990s, Bubble Jug wasn't just a candy that sold well. It was a candy that had stopped needing an introduction. A kid in a Cincinnati grocery store and a kid in a Sacramento drugstore both knew on sight what that squat purple and yellow jug meant and what it would do the moment they tipped it back. That kind of universal recognition without a single unifying commercial to point to as the reason, is its own kind of achievement. Bubble Jug never needed its own dedicated ad campaign because it didn't have to build brand trust from nothing. It borrowed it wholesale from the Hubba Bubba name already stamped across its label. The same purple and yellow branding, the same less sticky than the other guy's gum, promised that Wrigley had spent over a decade drilling into American kids through Wild West gum fighters and playground reputation. By the time Bubble Jug hit a shelf, a kid already trusted the name on the jug before they'd ever shaken it once. That inherited trust was the real engine behind its peak, and it's part of why the candy could rocket from regional test item to a fixture in tens of thousands of stores nationwide in the span of just a few years, without ever needing a commercial built specifically to explain what it was. What Bubble Jug did have, uniquely, was word of mouth that worked like a commercial anyway. It traveled classroom to classroom, cafeteria to cafeteria, in exactly the way a TV spot never could. One kid shaking a jug in front of another kid who had never seen one, pouring out a capful, watching a stranger's face do the thing everyone's face did the first time the powder hit their tongue and started to change. That performance repeated itself in tens of thousands of school cafeterias and bus stops across the country, an advertisement that ran constantly and cost the company nothing, powered entirely by kids who wanted to be the one holding the jug when someone else tried it for the first time. For the people making it, the height of Bubble Jug's run had a different texture entirely, less about magic and more about volume. Workers at the Yorkville plant who'd spent years running big league chew pouches or spooling bubble tape ribbon found themselves, for a stretch of the early to mid-90s, running powder and crystal lines at a pace that matched Amarol's best-selling novelty items. Sales reps covering drugstore and grocery accounts didn't have to pitch buyers on an unproven product anymore. By this point, refusing shelf space for Bubble Jug meant explaining to a district manager why a fast-turning, low-price impulse item wasn't in the store. It had gone in just a few years from a product Amarol's reps had to talk buyers into to one buyers were calling in to restock. Where the candy left its deepest mark, though, wasn't the sales figures. It was the calendar. Every October, drugstore seasonal bins and family-size Halloween assortments made room for Bubble Jug alongside the fun-size candy bars and bag sweets that dominated most porches. It wasn't the candy every single house handed out, the way a mini Snickers was, but it was common enough that finding a jug in a pillowcase felt like a small jackpot. A candy that took longer to enjoy than anything else in the bag, because it had a ritual built into it that a chocolate bar simply didn't. Inside schools, it found an even more specific niche. Kids who ran informal trading economies at lunch tables treated a full jug as serious currency, worth more than a single candy bar because it could be portioned out over days, a capful at a time, to friends who hadn't brought their own. And beneath all of that was the quieter, slower current of a candy becoming a family habit rather than just a kid's fad. Parents who'd grown up chewing Hubba Bubba gum themselves in the late 70s and early 80s, who remembered the gum fighter ads and the big bubbles, no troubles slogan from their own childhoods, were now the ones standing at the checkout lane, letting their own kids grab a jug off the rack. It wasn't nostalgia yet. Nostalgia hadn't had time to set in. It was something closer to inheritance. A brand a parent already trusted, handed forward without a second thought, becoming part of a second generation's checkout lane ritual before the first generation had even finished being kids about it themselves. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it's easy to rush past a peak on the way to a collapse. But nobody buying a jug off a drugstore rack in 1994 was thinking about collapse. They were thinking about the sting of powder on the tongue, the sound of a shake, the particular unfairness of a friend's pour being bigger than theirs. What made a candy this simple, powder in a plastic jug, become something an entire generation still describes in specific physical detail 3 decades later? Maybe it's that Bubble Jug never asked to be more than what it was. It didn't chase trends or reinvent itself. It just sat at the register, reliably waiting to be shaken. But reliability at the register is not the same thing as permanence on the shelf. And even while Bubble Jug was riding this high, the same forces reshaping the broader gum aisle, a shift toward long-lasting sticks, toward sugar-free formulas, toward candy that didn't depend on a kid's willingness to make a small mess, were already gathering, quietly, just out of sight of anyone standing at that checkout counter with a jug in hand. The trouble that eventually caught up with Bubble Jug didn't announce itself with a memo or a headline. It showed up first as small, easy-to-explain irregularities, the kind that get shrugged off in the moment and only look like the beginning of something bigger in hindsight, a shipment that came at a few cents more expensive than the last one. A buyer at a regional drugstore chain who mentioned, almost in passing, that a new imported powder candy from overseas was moving fast in the same rack space. None of it read as a crisis. All of it, looking back, was the crisis arriving early and quietly. Sugar and corn syrup prices were not stable through the 1990s, and a candy built almost entirely around sweetened powder and crystal felt that instability more directly than a candy with more filler and less raw sugar per ounce. Every fluctuation in commodity costs squeezed a product that was already priced low and sold on volume, the kind of impulse buy item that couldn't easily absorb a price increase without losing the exact quality that made it sell in the first place. Spare pocket change, no hesitation, no math. A 5-cent hike at the wholesale level could mean a decision, somewhere up the chain, about whether to shrink the jug, thin out a less popular flavor, or quietly let a region's order slip from monthly to seasonal. At the same time, Bubble Jug's category, novelty, powder, and crystal, pour-it-yourself candy, stopped being something only Amaral made well. Imported novelty candies, many of them out of Asian manufacturers who could produce flashy, cheap, powder-based confections at a lower cost than an Illinois plant retooled from pressed gum lines, began showing up in the same drugstore racks and gas station spinners that had once belonged almost entirely to Bubble Jug and its Amaral siblings. These weren't always direct copies. Some were pixie stick variations, some were sour powder candies with their own gimmicks, but they occupied the same shelf inch, competed for the same handful of loose change, and didn't carry decades of Wrigley overhead built into their price. A store manager outside Louisville, who'd restocked the same wire rack by his register every week through the early 90s, remembers the shift less as a single event than as a slow substitution. Where Bubble Jug used to sell through in days, by the middle of the decade, it was sitting a little longer between restocks. Not unsold exactly, but no longer the fastest mover on that rack. He started giving a little more shelf space to the newer imported powder candies, not because a regional manager told him to, but because that's simply what the registered doty told him to do. Nobody made a decision to phase Bubble Jug out. The shelf made the decision on its own, 1 week's sales numbers at a time. Inside the Yorkville plant, the pressure showed up differently, not as a single dramatic recipe change, but as a series of small cost adjustments that most kids buying the jug would never consciously notice, and yet somehow did. A slightly finer grind on the crystals to stretch a batch of flavoring further. A formulation tweak to keep the shake, pour, chew transformation working reliably even as ingredient costs pushed toward cheaper substitutes. None of it was documented publicly as a scandal, and none of it should be treated as one. But longtime buyers of a product built entirely around a specific sensory ritual are unusually good at detecting when that ritual has been quietly, incrementally altered. A woman who'd bought Great Bubble Jug for her kids throughout the early 90s later described, almost apologetically, that it just didn't pour the same by the time her youngest was old enough to want it too. She couldn't say exactly what had changed, only that something had. What makes this stretch of the story different from the crash still to come is that almost nobody living through it in real time understood they were watching a decline. A kid shaking a jug at a bus stop in 1994 had no reason to think about corn syrup futures or imported competitors. A store manager reordering slightly smaller quantities each month wasn't sounding an alarm. He was just responding to what the shelf told him. Even inside Amaral, the kind of company built on churning out dozens of novelty candy concepts a year, a single softening product wasn't treated as a crisis. It was treated as one line item among many, something to monitor rather than rescue, because there was always another novelty gum idea already moving through the pipeline behind it. That's the quiet cruelty of how a beloved product actually disappears. It doesn't get discontinued in a single decision anyone can point to later. It gets slowly deprioritized, region by region, shelf inch by shelf inch, until the absence is total and nobody can name the exact month it started. How long can a company keep asking the same price for a slightly different version of something a kid loved before the kid, without ever consciously deciding to, simply stops reaching for it? Nobody at Amuro was asking that question out loud in the mid-1990s, but the answer was already being written into the reorder numbers, one drugstore rack at a time, in towns that had no idea they were watching the beginning of the end. The decision that proved most consequential for Bubble Jug's long-term survival wasn't made by anyone thinking about Bubble Jug at all. In 2008, Wrigley, the company that had carried Hubba Bubba and all of its Amurol offshoots for nearly 3 decades, was purchased by Mars, incorporated in a deal worth roughly $23 billion, financed with backing from Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and Berkshire Hathaway. It was one of the largest transactions in candy industry history, and it folded a company that had spent 100 years selling exactly a handful of core products, gum, mints, a tightly controlled portfolio, into a global conglomerate that, by that point, already owned M&M's, Snickers, Twix, Skittles, and dozens of other brands spanning candy, pet food, and food service. Wrigley's approach to its own products, even its novelty lines through Amurol, had always been comparatively restrained. Mars's approach to a newly acquired portfolio was different by necessity. With hundreds of products now competing for marketing dollars, factory investment, and shelf space negotiating power inside one company, something had to be prioritized and something had to be left to quietly manage its own decline. Nobody needs to imagine a boardroom villain to understand what happened next, because the business logic was ordinary, even reasonable, from the perspective of anyone managing that size of portfolio. A novelty candy sold through impulse buy racks at drugstore registers, built around a single specific sensory ritual, priced low enough that its margins were thin to begin with, was never going to be a priority line in a company now managing global brands with far larger production runs and far more predictable consumer demand. Big League Chew and Bubble Tape, both with more name recognition and more stable annual sales, absorbed more of the manufacturing attention that used to be spread more evenly across Amurol's stranger novelty concepts. Bubble Jug, along with a handful of other niche powder and crystal candies in the same product family, became the kind of item that gets renewed year to year rather than invested in. Kept alive because discontinuing it outright required its own decision and paperwork, not because anyone was actively championing its growth. That's a less dramatic story than the one nostalgia often wants to tell, and it's worth being honest about that, because the alternative, inventing a single cost-cutting villain who ordered the recipe ruined on purpose, isn't supported by anything documented about how this candy actually declined. What is documented, and what the flavor history itself makes visible, is a slow narrowing. Grape and orange crush, the two flavors that once sat alongside tropical fruit on the same shelf, were discontinued by the manufacturer at some point in the years following the Mars acquisition. Not announced, not mourned publicly, simply absent from later product listings until only tropical fruit remained as the flavor a shopper could still occasionally find. A portfolio trimming exercise multiplied across hundreds of products company-wide doesn't need a single dramatic meeting. It only needs a spreadsheet, a list of SKUs ranked by sales velocity and margin, and a policy of not renewing the ones near the bottom. For the people who'd spent years on the Yorkville production lines, this kind of decline had a very specific physical texture. It wasn't a factory closing in a single dramatic announcement. Amurol's broader operation continued producing its more successful novelty lines for years afterward. But it was a production schedule that increasingly favored Bubble Tape's ribbon lines and Big League Chew's shredding equipment over the powder and crystal lines that had once run at full capacity for Bubble Jug. A worker who'd learned the particular maintenance quirks of the crystal filling machines. The ones prone to clogging if the grind came out too fine, the ones that needed recalibrating more often than the standard gum pressing lines, found that expertise mattering less and less as those machines ran fewer shifts per month. Nobody announced that this was the beginning of the end. It simply became the kind of equipment that got scheduled around rather than scheduled for. Sales reps covering drugstore and grocery accounts felt a parallel shift from the other direction. Where reps in the mid-1990s had fielded calls from buyers wanting Bubble Jug restocked faster, reps in the years after the Mars acquisition increasingly found themselves negotiating for the shelf space to simply be renewed at all, competing not just against imported powder candy knockoffs from overseas manufacturers, but against Mars's own much larger, much more heavily marketed core products, which had every incentive to expand into the same register-adjacent impulse space that a jug of tropical fruit had once occupied almost by itself. A candy that had once sold itself through cafeteria word of mouth now had to compete for a buyer's limited attention against brands with national television budgets behind them. If there was a single moment when the people closest to Bubble Jug understood, without needing to be told directly that its time was ending, it likely wasn't a memo. It was smaller and more ordinary than that. The kind of moment that happens inside declining product lines everywhere and rarely gets written down. A regional sales rep, filling out an order form for the following quarter, noticing that grape hadn't been offered as a reorder option in the latest product sheet, and understanding, without anyone confirming it, that the flavor simply wasn't coming back. A plant worker realizing the crystal filling line hadn't been scheduled for a full run in months, and wouldn't be again anytime soon. These are not the kind of facts that make it into a press release. They are the kind of facts that live only in the people who notice them, one quiet absence at a time, long before any customer standing at a checkout counter realized their favorite flavor was already gone. What stayed consistent throughout all of it, and this matters because it would be easy to tell this story as a betrayal, is that nothing about Bubble Jug's decline required bad faith from anyone involved. A regional buyer choosing to give shelf space to a faster-selling item was doing their job. A conglomerate prioritizing its highest margin, highest volume brands after a $23 billion acquisition was behaving exactly as any large company would. The tragedy, if that word even applies to a candy jug, wasn't that anyone set out to destroy something people loved. It was that something people loved simply wasn't profitable enough at large enough scale to survive contact with an industry that had gotten very good at measuring exactly how much love a product could generate per square inch of shelf space. And Bubble Jug, for all the joy it had given a generation of kids at bus stops and lunch tables, had never been built to win that particular kind of math. By the early 2000s, a jug of Bubble Jug was no longer something a kid could count on finding at the checkout counter of an ordinary grocery store or drugstore. There was no single day when a corporate memo went out declaring the product discontinued, no press release, no announcement anywhere that resembled a funeral. What happened instead was the same slow narrowing that had already claimed grape and orange crush years earlier, now widening to swallow the format itself. Regional buyers who'd been quietly reducing their orders for years finally stopped reordering altogether. A rack that used to hold 3 or 4 jugs at a time held one, then none, then simply carried something else. A newer imported powder candy, a bag of gummies, whatever filled the gap without anyone consciously deciding it should. The pace of that disappearance depended entirely on where a person happened to be standing. In some regions, drugstore chains pulled the item from standard planograms sometime in the early 2000s, the shelf inch reassigned to faster-turning candy with no fanfare at all. In others, Bubble Jug lingered longer in independent gas stations and mom-and-pop corner stores, the kind of retailers slower to update their orders, selling through old stock for months or years after the major chains had already moved on. There is no single verified date anyone can point to and say with certainty, this is when it ended. And that absence of a clean discontinuation date is itself part of the story. Bubble Jug didn't die in public. It faded out of stock rooms and reorder sheets in 100 small, undocumented moments in towns that had no reason to mark the occasion. What is documented, because the people who loved it made sure of it, is what happened next. The slow realization, spreading through message boards and candy nostalgia forums in the 2000s and 2010s, That a jug people assumed they could always find again someday simply wasn't there anymore. Reddit threads in nostalgia communities began accumulating posts asking variations of the same question. Does anyone remember this? Does anyone know where to find it? Am I imagining this candy existed at all? Facebook groups dedicated to bringing back discontinued snacks added Bubble Jug to their running lists of collectively mourned candy alongside other novelty items from the same Amaral era. At least one fan started a petition on change.org specifically asking Wrigley and its parent company to bring the full flavor lineup back to market. A modest, grassroots effort rather than a viral campaign, but a genuine one. And its very existence says something about how specifically people remembered this candy, decades after most of them had last held a jug in their hands. There was no eBay gold rush the way there sometimes is for a beloved candy's final production run. No documented case of someone paying inflated prices for a sealed, decades-old jug of grape, the way collectors sometimes do for vintage cereal boxes or unopened candy tins. Part of that is simply the nature of the product. Powdered candy doesn't preserve the way a sealed metal tin does, and a plastic jug of crystallized sugar has little of the durable collectible appeal of a cardboard box or a glass bottle. What survived instead wasn't the physical candy, but the memory of the ritual, the shake, the pour, the sting, then settled transformation on the tongue, passed around online in exactly the same way it had once been passed around a lunch table, one description at a time, one person confirming to another that yes, this had been real. Yes, someone else remembered it too. Mainstream food media largely missed this particular loss when it happened, and that absence of coverage is itself worth noting honestly rather than glossing over. Bubble Jug never received the kind of retrospective obituary that outlets wrote for bigger, discontinued brands. No dedicated feature the year it quietly left regional shelves. No trade press analysis of what its decline signaled about the novelty candy category. Its disappearance surfaces today mostly in listicles about vanished 1990s candy, a few sentences in a longer roundup of gum you forgot existed, alongside bubble tape and ouch. Bubblegum and Hubba Bubba Max. That relative quiet doesn't mean fewer people loved it. It means the candy occupied a tier of American shelf life, beloved, specific, deeply remembered by the people who bought it, that rarely gets the kind of institutional memory that follows a flagship brand. Its mourning happened person to person in comment sections and forum threads, rather than in print. Inside the Yorkville, Illinois plant, where Bubble Jug had once run at full production during its early 1990s peak, the decline showed up not as a single closure, but as a slow reallocation of machinery and attention that had been building for years by the time it finally reached its quiet end. The powder and crystal filling lines that had briefly rivaled Amaral's more famous ribbon and shredding equipment in the mid-1990s were, by the 2000s, running on a fraction of their old schedule, retooled increasingly toward whatever novelty product Amaral's pipeline had decided to prioritize that year. There is no record of a specific announcement to plant workers that Bubble Jug had reached its end. The more honest account is that the equipment simply stopped being scheduled for full runs, the way machinery quietly gets phased out of rotation at any large manufacturing operation once the product it makes no longer justifies dedicated shifts. What makes this particular collapse different from a dramatic factory closing story is that it never fully closed. That distinction matters, and it's worth being precise about it, rather than flattening the story into something simpler than it actually was. Somewhere in the years that followed, even as Grape and Orange Crush vanished for good, and the item disappeared from the standard drugstore and grocery planograms that had once carried it nationwide, a version of tropical fruit persisted at the margins, sold through specialty candy retailers who kept legacy novelty items alive for exactly the customers who'd never stopped looking for them. It wasn't the same triumphant national presence it had once held at checkout counters coast to coast. It was a candy that had, in the most literal sense, been reduced from everywhere to somewhere if you knew where to look, which is its own particular kind of loss, quieter than a full disappearance, but no less real to the people who'd once been able to grab a jug without a second thought. Picture a specific moment instead of a statistic. A shopper somewhere in the early 2000s, maybe in her 30s by then, standing at a drugstore checkout lane out of habit, glancing toward the rack where the jug used to sit the way she had 100 times as a kid, and finding nothing there. Not even an empty peg, just a different candy entirely, as if the space had simply forgotten what used to belong to it. She wouldn't have known in that moment that she was witnessing the tail end of a years-long fade rather than a single dramatic pull. She would only have known that something specific and familiar wasn't there anymore, and that there was no one behind the counter who could tell her why, because by then, the why had already happened, quietly years earlier, in a spreadsheet and a reorder sheet neither of them would ever see. That's how this one ended. Not with an announcement, not with a final lot code anyone photographed for posterity, not with a stampede of collectors driving prices skyward on a marketplace built for nostalgia. It ended the way most beloved mid-tier candies actually end. Through 1,000 small absences that added up region by region, reorder sheet by reorder sheet, until the candy that had once been a lunchroom currency for an entire generation became something that generation could only describe to each other, hoping someone else remembered it too, and remarkably finding that someone almost always did. Architected comprehensive, chapter balancing economic impact, product history, and tonal transition. Architected comprehensive chapter balancing economic impact, product history, and tonal transition. What filled the gap Bubble Jug left behind wasn't one single product so much as an entire shift in what an impulse buy candy was expected to be. Long-lasting gum sticks, sugar-free pellets in resealable pocket tins, and the kind of individually wrapped candies that didn't require any ritual at all, just tear and chew, took over the same register-adjacent shelf space that Bubble Jug and its Amurol siblings had once claimed almost by default. These newer products asked nothing of the person buying them. No shake, no pour, no gamble about how much would come out. That absence of ceremony was, in a sense, the whole point. An industry that had spent the 90s indulging kids' appetite for novelty spent the 2000s correcting toward convenience, and a candy built entirely around a small, messy ritual didn't fit where the category was heading. The revival attempts that did surface were modest, grassroots, and genuine rather than corporate. The Change.org petition asking for the full flavor lineup's return never generated the kind of viral momentum that brings a discontinued snack back to national shelves, but it didn't need to in order to matter. It stands as documented proof that people specifically remembered Grape and Orange Crush by name, decades after either flavor had left a shelf, which is its own kind of tribute. More tangibly, specialty candy retailers kept a version of the format alive by continuing to stock tropical fruit, sourced through smaller distribution channels built for exactly this kind of legacy nostalgia item. And more recently, another company, Iconic Candy, a business built specifically around reviving discontinued snacks like Creme Savers and Bar None, brought a modern version of the jug back to market under its own label, powder and chicle pieces included, marketed openly to the generation that remembered the original. It's worth being honest about what that revival actually represents. Not a triumphant return of the exact 1990s product in its original form, but a smaller company recognizing, correctly, that the memory of this candy still had commercial value even after the original manufacturer had let it fade. The broader lesson Bubble Jug's decline offers the food industry isn't really about corn syrup prices or corporate acquisitions, even though both played a role. It's about the fragility of novelty itself as a business model. A candy that sells because it's strange, ritualistic, and fun to perform in front of a friend has a shorter natural runway than a candy that simply tastes good and asks nothing else of the person eating it. Bubble tape survived into the present day, partly because stretching gum out of a container remained a simple, repeatable pleasure that didn't depend on precision or mess tolerance. Bubble Jug's core appeal, the unpredictability of the pour, the gamble in every capful, was also eventually the thing that made it harder to standardize, harder to defend on a spreadsheet, and easier to quietly deprioritize once a parent company had hundreds of other products competing for the same manufacturing attention. The economic footprint of that decline was small compared to a factory town built entirely around one product, and it's important not to overstate it. Amaral's Yorkville, Illinois operation didn't close because of Bubble Jug's fade. The plant continued producing other novelty candy lines for years afterward, and the broader Wrigley and later Mars manufacturing presence in the region remained intact. What changed was narrower and more specific. The loss of dedicated shifts on the powder and crystal filling equipment, the gradual reassignment of workers who'd once specialized in maintaining machinery built for this one strange format, and the quiet end of a product line that had for a few years in the early 90s run at a pace matching Amaral's best-known novelty items. It's a story of a shrinking niche within a larger, still functioning operation, not a story of a town losing its reason to exist. Outside the United States, no clear import equivalent stepped in to fill American shoppers' specific craving the way, say, a foreign chocolate bar might fill the gap left by a discontinued domestic one. Powder and crystal novelty candies do exist in other markets, and some of the imported competitors that had originally squeezed Bubble Jug's shelf space in the mid-1990s are still sold today. But none of them carry the specific tropical fruit, grape, and orange crush flavor identity or the Hubba Bubba name recognition that made the original feel irreplaceable to the kids who grew up on it. What that means, practically, is that the people who miss this candy most specifically have had to settle either for a smaller company's tribute version or for nothing at all, which may explain why the online communities keeping its memory alive have stayed as active and specific as they have, for a product that never had a dramatic ending to rally around in the first place. What does it mean for a candy to survive not as a product on a shelf, but only as a specific, repeatable memory shared between strangers online who've never met, connected by nothing, but the fact that they both remember exactly how it felt to pour a capful into their palm and wait for it to turn into gum? Bubble Jug's afterlife suggests an answer that applies well beyond one plastic jug from Yorkville, Illinois. That the disappearance of a shelf item and the disappearance of the ritual it created are two different losses. And the second one, the harder one to replace, is the one an entire generation is still quietly keeping alive. Somewhere right now, a woman in her 50s is standing in a candy store she wandered into for no particular reason, and her hand stops on a small plastic jug she hasn't seen in 30 years. She doesn't pick it up right away. She just stands there for a second, feeling the specific weight of a memory arrive before she's even touched anything. The rattle of crystals against plastic, the tilt of a wrist she hasn't used since she was 9 years old, the exact sting of tropical fruit hitting her tongue before it settled into something she could actually chew. She remembers splitting one on a walk home from the bus stop with a friend whose last name she can no longer recall, both of them arguing without ever quite agreeing on what counted as a fair pour. She remembers her brother shaking his jug like a maraca just to make her beg for it. None of that required the candy to still be sitting on a shelf somewhere. It only required her to see the shape of the container again, and the whole afternoon came back at once. What a jug of powdered candy actually gave a generation of American kids was never really about the flavor, even though the flavor mattered enough that people still argue online about whether grape or tropical fruit was better. It was about the fact that Bubble Jug asked something of the kid holding it. It demanded a small act of ceremony, the shake, the pour, the gamble of not knowing exactly how much would come out. At an age when most of childhood's pleasures were handed over already finished, already decided, no participation required. A candy bar was the same experience every single time. Bubble Jug was a little different every time you tipped it back, and that unpredictability is exactly what made it worth performing in front of a friend, worth rationing out capful by capful at a lunch table, worth remembering specifically enough, decades later, that strangers on the internet can still describe the precise tilt of the wrist it took to get it right. It mattered too, because it belonged to a particular kind of American childhood that didn't require much money to participate in. A jug cost pocket change, bottle return money, a few coins scraped together, no parent's permission required beyond the initial nickel or dime. That accessibility made it democratic in a way a lot of childhood pleasures aren't. Every kid at that bus stop, regardless of what else they had or didn't have, could afford to be the one holding the jug that day. And for a few minutes, that was enough to make you popular. No replacement candy since has quite recreated that specific combination, cheap enough for any kid to buy, strange enough to be worth performing, and social enough that it was almost always better shared than eaten alone. So let this be said plainly, without dressing it up as bigger than it was, and without pretending it wasn't real. A small candy company in Yorkville, Illinois made something strange and a little bit silly, and for a handful of years in the early 1990s, it became one of the specific textures of American childhood. The workers who kept those crystal filling machines running through their finicky clogs deserve to be remembered for that, even if none of them ever expected the job to matter beyond a paycheck. The kids who shook those jugs at bus stops and lunch tables deserve to have that memory taken seriously, not laughed off as some forgotten curiosity from a decade that produced a lot of strange candy. And the candy itself, gone from most shelves now, except where a smaller company chose to bring a version of it back, deserves this much: an honest accounting of exactly what it was and exactly why it was worth remembering. Nobody needs to mourn a plastic jug the way they'd mourn something larger. But it's fair to say that something real disappeared when the reorder sheets stopped including it, region by region, without ceremony. A specific taste, a specific ritual, a specific kind of unfairness in how much your friend poured versus how much you got. All of it real, all of it gone from most shelves now, and all of it still, somehow, exactly as clear in memory as it was the day it happened.